Winter buried the small town of Butte, Montana, in silence and snow. Inside a smoky bar, a deal was being made, not for gold or land, but for a woman. Her name was Sarah Turner. Tall, pale, wind-burned cheeks, hands cracked from work. Her father and brother called her useless, then sold her like a broken thing. But then, through the door stepped Ethan Cole, a scarred war veteran, and his German shepherd, Ranger. The cold followed them in, but so did something else, mercy. Ethan laid down a faded war medal, not to buy her, but to buy her a choice. That night, Sarah walked out into the snow beside a soldier and his dog, but did she escape her past, or walk into something even deeper? Chapter 1. The Deal in the Snow. Snow-smothered Butte, Montana, whitening alleys and muting sirens. Inside the copper lantern, a low-ceilinged bar that smelled of spilled rye and wet wool. The jukebox had died hours ago, and the regulars clung to their glasses like lanterns in a mine. A space opened near the door when it creaked and let in a blade of night air. Sarah Turner stood close to that draft, as if cold could burn away the grime of this place. She was 26, tall and willow-slim in a borrowed gray coat that pinched at the shoulders. Dark brown hair, frayed at the ends, escaped her knit cap. Her skin held the winter pallor of someone who worked inside other people's shadows. Freckled nose pink from wind, lips chapped, hands red and cracked from dishwater. She had the kind of blue-gray eyes that looked tired even when she was rested, except she wasn't. She hadn't been in a long time. There was a steadiness about how she held herself, chin tucked but not bowed, a learned quiet which wasn't submission so much as triage. Save breath, save heat, save hope for when it counts. Bill Turner, her father, leaned on the bar with a sullen authority that belonged to men who never earned it. 50-something, barrel-bellied under a patched ranch jacket, whiskey-bloom cheeks, a nicotine-yellowed mustache that curled when he smiled at his own jokes. Work had once thickened his hands. Gambling and drink had softened them back into demand. His voice, loud enough for everyone to hear, cast verdicts that pretended to be facts. "She's no kind of help," he told the room. "Can't hold a job without whinin', can't keep a man interested, can't even smile right. Useless is a mercy word." Jake Turner, 28, stood to Bill's right, tall and thick-shouldered in a cheap leather coat that squeaked when he moved. A buzzed fade cut made his ears jut, and a small white scar ticked up from his lip, souvenir of some fight he claimed to win. His smile was permanent and crooked, designed to be seen across a table and make a man fold. He rolled a quarter across his knuckles and looked at Sarah like she was the pot he'd already raked. "Offers don't last forever, Dad," Jake said, glancing toward Horace Malloy, the owner of the Copper Lantern, a prune-faced man with a red nose and a vest shiny at the buttons. "Malloy's feeling generous." Horace Malloy pushed a chipped mug aside and set out a stained envelope that clinked when it met wood. "Room and board," he said, voice syrupy. "Plus what she can make if she's friendly. That's more than the market pays for trouble." Sarah tasted copper and old fear. She could name every nail missing from the bar's footrail, could count the roach tracks above the back room door. Her life here had been a series of small survivals. Keep your head down, keep your paycheck, keep the bruises where sleeves can hide them. It had also been a series of erasures, register tips that vanished. Apologies swallowed, because the men were louder, the town was louder, the winter was loudest. Bill tapped 2 fingers on the envelope. "Well," he said, not to Sarah but to the room, to the idea of a decision he would pretend belonged to him even if it cost him nothing. The door opened again, and this time the cold didn't slip in so much as walk, step by deliberate step, long-limbed and quiet. Ethan Cole filled the doorway without trying. He was late 30s, tall in a way that had learned not to loom, lean like a runner built from sinew and restraint, shoulders squared by habit, not pride. A wool watch cap shadowed gray eyes. His face was the map of a man who had walked too far. Weather-creased brow, a healed cut through one eyebrow, a jaw dusted with stubborn stubble. His nose was slightly crooked, kissed left by something that did not apologize. His hands, when he unwound them from his gloves, showed rough knuckles and a knotted scar along the webbing between thumb and forefinger, the kind that comes from catching a falling thing that cut you anyway. He wore a service-worn field jacket, patched at one elbow, and a canvas rucksack with a name tape stitched inside. Cole E. Because some things you carry even when you don't need to be labeled. He didn't smell like cologne or kitchen grease. He smelled like cold air, gun oil's ghost, and pine. At his heel padded a German shepherd that could not be mistaken for a pet by anyone who had ever met a working animal. Ranger was 5 years old and moved like a quiet decision. Sable coat layered thick for the weather, a neat saddle of black along his back, alert ears, amber eyes that flicked to every exit and then back to Ethan as if counting. A notch scar cut the rim of his right ear like a bite taken out of the moon. He wore a simple leather collar without a tag and bore the patience of a creature trained to wait until told it was safe. When a chair scraped too quick, Ranger's head turned. When a glass shattered, he didn't flinch. Ethan's gaze traveled the room with the caution of a man who had learned the hard way to read angles and hands, to locate threats by absence as much as presence. Afghanistan had been dust and brightness and metal. Home was snow and dim rooms and the same chess. Once, on a road outside Sangin, an IED had lifted his world and set it down wrong. The ringing had never quite left. He didn't talk about that because talking made the pictures sharper, not softer. He was not unkind. He was rationed. Bill Turner's voice swaggered toward Ethan before his body did. "We're busy," Bill announced, owning what he didn't own. "Unless you got business." Ethan's eyes settled on Sarah, not past her, not at her as commodity. He saw the coat too thin, the split knuckles, the way she shifted her weight to keep heat in her core. He let the quiet lengthen because silence can be permission. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, the kind of tone you use with a spooked horse or a boy with a gun. "If she's no use to you," Ethan said, "I'll take responsibility. She gets a warm room, a hot meal, and the same thing any of us should have had coming back. Choice." Jake laughed, a coin-bright sound. "You adopting strays now, soldier?" he said, dragging out the last word as if mocking the stitching in Ethan's jacket. "How about you let the grown-ups do business?" Ranger's ears twitched. Ethan's hand dropped casual, 2 fingers brushing the dog's shoulder. "How about the person you're discussing speaks for herself?" Ethan said. Horace Malloy lifted both palms. "No trouble. It's a simple arrangement." "Arrangements," Ethan said, "are what people make. Sales are for objects." Bill's mouth curled. "And you plan to pay for your sermon with what? Morals?" Ethan reached into his rucksack and placed a worn, velvet-covered box on the bar. Inside lay a bronze service medal, its ribbon frayed at one corner from being handled more than worn. He didn't look at it. "I traded more than this to get here," he said. "But tonight, this is collateral. I'm not buying her. I'm standing between her and a bad deal until she can stand there herself. She leaves with me if she wants. If she doesn't, I leave with the dog and the snow takes the rest." A hush fell so complete even the ice machine coughed more quietly. Sarah felt something unfamiliar blossom in her chest, a wedge of air, fragile but real. It wasn't rescue she felt. It was room. Bill barked a laugh that failed to convince his own lungs. "Girl," he said, with the faux patient cadence of a man dragging a child through a lie, "tell the hero thank you and hand me that box." Sarah looked at the medal and at the man who had set it down without reverence because reverence belonged elsewhere. She thought of all the times she had been told no. No to school, no to quiet, no to the last of the coffee because men needed it more. She thought of nights listening to the parking lot fights, morning shifts with swollen eyes, afternoons measuring herself against the invisible measurements of others. Then she looked at Jake and saw not a brother but a symptom, a man who had learned that power could be stolen with a smirk because someone had taught him to smirk. She looked at Bill and saw the end of a cage disguised as inheritance. She straightened her coat and said, "I'll leave now." Jake's smile died on his face like a match in slush. Bill sputtered. "With who?" "With the man who asked me," she said. Ethan did not touch her. He stepped back so she could pass. Ranger rose, a shadow with a heartbeat, and fell in at her other side as if she had always been part of the formation. Horace Malloy reached for the medal, but Ethan closed the box and left it behind, without comment, as if payment were for the room to witness itself. Outside, the cold struck clean. The street lamps wore halos of ice, and the snow made a hush that belonged to cathedrals and hospitals and the seconds after a shot. Sarah's breath fogged and then thinly vanished. Ethan gave her his spare knit cap from a pocket, the yarn softened by years. "You can change your mind at any point between here and the next mile," he said. "After that, you can change it again. There's a bus in the morning if you want the city instead. I'm not the destination. I'm a door." "And the dog?" she asked, voice small but not weak. "He's the reminder," Ethan said, looking down at Ranger with a corner smile that lived and died without reaching his mouth. "That we are pack animals who keep forgetting it." They walked east, where the town thinned into a ridge of pines and low, wind-bent houses. Sarah matched Ethan's pace. She noticed that he never stepped directly behind her, always off to one side, as if guarding both flank and space. She noticed that Ranger ranged a few yards ahead, pausing at intersections to look back for a sign, a small nod, a word. A train moaned in the distance like something old beginning again. "I'm Sarah," she said at last, as their footsteps found a rhythm. "Ethan," he replied, and let the syllables be enough. "Ranger," she tried, and the dog's ear flicked at his name. For a mile they were nothing more than 3 moving shadows and the sound of a winter night. The first house lights had long darkened behind drawn curtains, the kind that hid warmth like contraband. When her teeth began to chatter, Ethan slowed outside a small, slumped-roof bungalow at the edge of the woods, a place that had once been painted green and now wore the color of surrender. "It's not much," he said, "but the roof holds. There's a stove. You can sleep inside. I'll take the porch." She wanted to say, "You don't have to." She wanted to say, "Thank you." What she said was, "Do you always do that?" "What?" "Give away the warmest place." Ethan looked at Ranger, who sat and watched them with that patient, ancient dog mind that already knew the answer. "No," he said. "Only when I remember I'm not the only one in the cold." He opened the door. The smell of old wood and soap greeted them. He turned on a small lamp with a pull chain shaped like a star. The room felt like an apology someone had finally delivered. He set a pot on the stove, measured rice by eye, added broth and carrot coins, the small grace of heat taking the air's bite. Sarah shrugged out of her coat and folded it carefully over the chair because care must start somewhere. When he put a steaming bowl in her hands, she thought the weight might melt her fingers. They ate in that comfortable quiet that happens when hunger is respected. Ethan set a blanket by the single bed and placed a folded sweater at its foot. He took his own bedroll and headed for the porch. Ranger hesitated, eyes on Sarah, then after a soft click of Ethan's tongue chose the threshold, lying across it like a bar in a door, not to keep her in, but to keep the world out. Sarah watched the man and his dog and felt the internal architecture of fear shift, one joist at a time. She didn't know what came next, only that this wasn't a sale and she wasn't inventory. She lay down with the kind of exhaustion that belongs to relief. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the stove ticked as it cooled, and Ranger's breath drew a lullaby line through the room. She closed her eyes around a thought simple enough to survive the night. I walked out. I chose. I will choose again. And that is the whole of tonight's story. How a woman stepped through a door a soldier held open. How a dog lay across the world to make a room of it. How winter heard and kept the secret until morning. Chapter 2. The Cabin at the Edge of the Woods. Morning broke pale and sharp, frost glazing the porch rails and the pines beyond. The day was so cold, it made sound travel farther. Even the click of Ranger's nails on the floor seemed bright. Ethan rose with the plain economy of someone who had learned to put motion before thought. Kettle on, stove coaxed, woodbox topped. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and broth and a slant of winter sun that turned the room into a clean geometry. Table, chair, one window, one door, one dog laid across the threshold like a promise. She sat up slowly, testing the newness. She was tall and narrow in the blanket, hair a tangle of dark ribbon against the pillow. The pallor of her cheeks warmed now by sleep. The small freckles along her nose suddenly not a flaw, but a map. "You can still go back," Ethan said from the stove without looking over, voice certain but unpressing. "Or forward if back means the city. Bus runs at 9. I'll walk you there." "What's forward?" she asked. He set a mug down. "Anything we build." Ranger lifted his head at the word build, as if it was one he liked. He was 5 years old, a mature working dog at the peak of his grace, sable coat thick and clean, breath steady, eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that can both obey and decide. His right ear's notched rim gave him a slightly rakish look, as if he'd survived a story he chose not to brag about. After breakfast, Ethan opened a low cabinet and pulled out a folded tarp and a crate of hand tools worn to friendly shapes. Hammer with a smoothed handle. Box plane whose brass gleamed where the finish had worn. A carpenter's square with engraved initials EC and small dents like stars. "The roof leaks at the seam over the stove," he said. "Was going to fix it before the real storms." He did not ask for help. He assumed usefulness without forcing it. Sarah took the hammer anyway, testing its weight. Outside, the wind laid a fine veil of powder across the steps. Ethan showed her how to place the ladder, how to tie it off to the porch post so a gust wouldn't turn help into hazard. He climbed first and talked her through every step, how to carry nails in a coffee can stuffed with rags to keep them from freezing your fingers, how to kneel across the rafters so the weight rides wood, not air. He didn't grab her when she wobbled. He breathed and waited. Ranger watched, a statue below, ears tracking the scrape of shingles. They moved like two people learning a language where kindness is grammar. By noon, the seam was sealed, and the stove corner stopped sighing cold. Back inside, Ethan set a board across the table and, with a carpenter's pencil, slowly drew letters. S-A-R-A-H. His script was neat but blocky, the hand of a man trained to write coordinates and supply numbers and names on casualty lists, every stroke holding. "You said last night you got sent home early from school, more than you got kept late," he said. "If you want, we can start here. Not because letters fix anything, because they give you names for the places that hurt and the places that don't." She felt heat prickle behind her eyes in a way that was not submission but relief. She traced the letters, her fingers rough from dishwater, the pencil leaving clean graphite that made a sound like a match starting. Ranger rested his chin on her knee and exhaled approval. When the kettle hissed, Ethan moved to pour, and the sleeve of his field jacket slipped back, showing a thin white seam at his wrist. Shrapnel's handwriting. "How long were you there?" she asked. He set the kettle down, watching steam ghost. "2 tours. The year I came back, I thought the loud was the problem. Turns out the quiet was a worse echo." He said it simply, without angling for pity, like a man inventorying facts. There was an explosion, she guessed. He nodded once. And a decision I remade 1,000 times after, because the first time didn't have enough angles. He scratched Ranger's neck. He came later after the hospital, partnered with a handler who deployed twice. When his handler didn't come home, I signed for him. I figured we were both people who needed a job that wasn't over. In the afternoon, they walked the tree line to bring in downed branches for kindling. The forest wore ice like lace. Sarah learned the rhythm of sled and rope, how to let the pull ride the hips, not the back, and how Ranger circles ahead and marks fresh tracks with a low, rumbling whoof. Coyote, deer, a fox's stitched embroidery across the creek. They spoke little. The day spoke enough. At the edge of the woods, a small figure waved from the road. Mrs. Inez Alvarez, 60, owner of the roadside grocery that stubbornly outlived chain stores, trudged with a bag hooked in the crook of her arm. She was short and broad, hipped in a practical way, as she liked to joke. Bundled in a teal parka with a fur-lined hood, cheeks apple-bright, eyes sharp as quilting needles. She had the kind of smile that came with a ruler if you misbehaved. A widow of 20 years, she ran the store like a general, fair on prices, ruthless on gossip, and generous when she thought you weren't looking. "I brought the flour you forgot and the mail you avoided," she said, thrusting the bag at Ethan, who ducked his head in a guilty half-grin. Her gaze slid to Sarah and assessed not like a border guard, but like a godmother. "You must be the new weather I heard about." Sarah said, suddenly self-conscious under Alvarez's inventory. Too thin coat, chapped hands, the watchfulness in her eyes. "Welcome," Inez said, all business. "You're safe here until you say otherwise. I won't say more because that's how safety works. And if that father of yours shows up, he'll learn Mrs. Alvarez keeps a bat under the counter with more home runs than his breath has. Excuses." She winked and patted Ranger, who tolerated it with sovereign gravity. "Good dog. You look like a sergeant." "He is," Ethan said, "in his head." After she left, the silence felt wider but friendlier, like a room someone had dusted. Dusk arrived with the blue that only belongs to deep winter, and the house smelled of onions softening in butter. Ethan taught her how to chop without fear, Curling fingers, guiding the knife, he showed her how to salt in the pan, not on the plate, so flavor climbs, not sits. They ate with the easy appetite that honest work brings. Later, he spread a laminated topo map of the hillside and traced trails with his knuckle. "If you want to walk to town without roads, here, here, and here," he said. "If you ever feel like you need to leave fast, there's a fire road that cuts through this notch. Snowdrifts, but passable. You don't need a reason to go. You don't even have to tell me." She listened and felt the strange steadiness of being given exit signs without being pushed toward them. Ranger yawned, baring teeth white and clean, then thumped his tail. "What about you?" she asked. "Where would you go if you had to leave fast?" Ethan looked at the map and then at the window where the dark had deepened. "I used to think away was a place," he said. "Turns out it's just a direction you walk until the thing inside you catches up, sits down, and asks if you're done yet." The wind feathered the eaves. Somewhere far down in the valley, a siren pealed and then faded. Sarah picked up the pencil again, drew her name a second time, letters steadier. "What did you do before?" "Carpentry," he said. "Barns, porches, a little cabinet work. Before that, ranch hand, odd jobs. Before that, a son who left when he was too proud to stay and not proud enough to say why." "Family?" He stirred the stew and said nothing for a long time, the kind of pause that isn't refusal but repair. "A younger brother," he said at last. "We broke each other's noses in high school and pretended it meant something. Then I left. Then he left. War makes you think distance is duty. Turns out sometimes duty is staying." He shrugged and smiled a small apology meant for someone far away. After dinner, he took the bedroll to the porch again. The porch light lit snow into slow rain. Sarah stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, and said, "You can keep the bed. I'm not made of glass." "But you're new here," he said. "New things break easy." "I'm not new," she said. "I'm just new to breathing." He laughed once, a rusted sound that oiled itself into something warmer. "Fair." He closed the door behind him. Ranger looked from Sarah to the door and made a choice. He curled by the bed, a ribcage's rise and fall in the half-light. In the night, Sarah woke to a memory's grip, and then to Ranger's nose bumping her wrist, a soft huff that said, "Now, not then." She breathed and counted the dog's breaths and let the room's simple list, table, chair, stove, dog, prime her heart back to ordinary. In the morning, she found a note propped against the coffee pot, Ethan's handwriting neat as planed wood. "Store run with Mrs. Alvarez. Back by noon. If you go for a walk, take Ranger. He knows his way home better than both of us." She stepped outside. The snow had a thin crust that sang underfoot. The woods stood up straight and watched her without malice. She walked the path he had pointed to, one gloved hand in Ranger's fur, reading the quiet like scripture. By the time Ethan returned with a sack of flour, a sack of potatoes, and Mrs. Alvarez's opinions, Sarah had stacked kindling, shoveled the walk, and written her name 10 times until it looked like a word that belonged to her and not to anyone else. She put the pencil down, felt her heartbeat land in the right place, and recognized that a line had been crossed so gently it didn't bruise. Chapter 3. The Past Finds the Road. Wind came in hard from the gorge, carving the afternoon into knives. By then the roof held tight, the stove behaved, and a circle of warmth existed in the room that felt earned. Sarah was mid-sentence, lips forming the rounded O in home, when Ranger's head snapped up and angled toward the road, ears sharp with a message. Ethan froze for half a breath, then moved to the window, placing himself slightly to the side so glass wouldn't frame him, a tactical habit that looked like modesty from far away. He parted the curtain with 2 fingers. A pickup crawled the hill, blue paint scabbed with rust, exhaust coughing, 2 men in the cab outlined in the ghost light of a winter sun. He didn't need to see faces to know. The shape of trouble is often enough. "Company," he said quietly. Ranger stood. The truck pulled into the rutted shoulder, tires crunching ice. Bill Turner climbed out first, stomping like a man pretending not to be cold. In daylight, he looked more used up. Cap pulled low, jaw rough with 2 days' beard, and a lifetime of choices that came easy. Jake unfolded from the passenger side, bigger in the daylight, the kind of bulk that comes from gym mirrors and rage that never learned to do real work. He wore fingerless gloves because he liked his knuckles visible. His eyes were the pale blue of old glass, pretty until you realized you couldn't see through them. They didn't wait to be invited. Men like that assume thresholds are theirs to erode. Ethan opened the door and stepped onto the porch with the quiet of a man who knows noise isn't a weapon unless you want it to be. Ranger planted himself slightly forward and right of Ethan's knee, classic cover, head high, tail level, a low hum in his chest like the engine of a patient truck. "Afternoon," Ethan said, voice empty of greeting, full of boundary. Bill looked past him, into the house. "Sarah," he barked, as if names were leashes. "Get your coat." Sarah stood in the doorway behind Ethan, tall and still, hands clean, hair braided in a quick plait she'd taught herself that morning with stubborn fingers. The bruise-colored circle under each of her eyes had lightened to something like shadow, not injury. "No," she said, and the word left her mouth like breath on glass. Simple, visible, true. Jake smirked and stepped onto the lowest stair. "Cute," he said. "You get a new script, sis? This the part where the stray dog and the soldier teach you big words?" Ranger's hum grew a half-tone darker. Ethan glanced at him, and the hum flattened to a warning. "Not yet." Bill tried reason, the kind that wears threats like cologne. "There's a man in Anaconda who's willing to do right by a woman who needs taking care of," he said. "He's got money, and he ain't picky where a woman's been. You were an expense. This is a return." Sarah's breath shortened. She had known something like this would walk, up the road, wearing some mask of civilization. "I'm not a debt," she said. "I'm a person." "Everybody's a debt to someone," Jake said, leaning closer, his grin knife-thin. Ethan moved down one stair, started talking not to them, but to the geometry of the situation. "You've said your piece," he said evenly. "She has said hers. There's coffee in town, and doors that aren't mine you can keep knocking on." Bill's mouth twisted, not liking the lack of altercation. Some men only understand weather if it storms. "You think I won't walk in that house and put her in the truck?" "I think you won't," Ethan said, "because you brought a witness you didn't notice." He tilted his head toward the road. Mrs. Alvarez stood a dozen yards back, parka bright as a buoy, phone held without apology. With her was Hank Doyle, 72, a retired miner with a bent spine and a face that had folded into permanent good humor and permanent distrust, depending on who he was looking at. Hank was narrow as a fence post, wiry in a flannel jacket that looked older than Jake, gray hair like steel wool crammed under a watch cap. He leaned on a cane carved with his own whittling. Small fish, a trout, a rosary of dents from years of use. Hank's jaw flexed around nothing. A man who'd quit chewing tobacco but not the habit of moving it around. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Hank called, voice dry as timber. "I reckon that phone sees better than the sheriff's glasses. Smile if you like the county jail. Jake spat on the step, a comic book gesture that looked smaller in cold light. We're here for family, he said. So are we, Mrs. Alvarez said. We just choose ours different. Bill set his boot on the next stair, testing the limit like a child and a river. Ranger's lip twitched to show the idea of teeth. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He spoke to Sarah without turning. You want to stand behind me, I'll stand. You want to stand beside me, we'll stand. You want me to go inside, I'll go inside. Sarah stepped forward until her shoulder lined with his. She wasn't shaking. Or she was, and it had finally become a tremor of decision, not fear. You don't get to talk about me like I'm a coupon, she told Bill, or sell me like I'm a busted truck. You never taught me to read because you were afraid of what I'd say if I knew the right words. Well, I learned enough. Her voice didn't break. The cold held it straight. No. The word landed the way a door closes. Bill laughed too loud, fooling no one. You'll regret this, he said. Maybe. She cupped her hands against her coat for heat, then let them fall. But I'll own it. Jake's face flushed a blotchy red. He took the last step in one lunge. Ethan didn't go for the showy move. He chose the sure one. He shifted weight, set his palm in the center of Jake's chest, and pushed. Not hard, just precise, timing the ice beneath Jake's boot. Jake skidded, windmilled, and sat down fast in the snow, curse breaking into pieces on his teeth. Ranger didn't bark. He simply stood taller, that hum in his chest now a line you could trip over if you were foolish. Hank chuckled once. A small, satisfied sound drawn up from a well of Western justice. Mrs. Alvarez lifted her phone higher so the lens could see the nasty parts men believe only happen off camera. Bill grabbed Jake's elbow and hauled him up. His face had gone old. Rage oxidizes quick in winter. He looked at Sarah, and something like recognition flickered. Oh, this is not a girl I can push with the old words. You don't come back from this, he said. Not as a threat, but as a prophecy he hoped still had teeth. I hope not, Sarah said. I don't want to come back. The wind shifted and carried the smell of wood smoke from the cabin and diesel from the truck and something else. Quiet, long-awaited. Bill and Jake climbed into the cab. The truck fishtailed once and then found the ruts down the hill. Mrs. Alvarez lowered the phone and tucked it into her parka like a bird. Tea later, she said to Sarah matter-of-factly, because shaking takes sugar. Hank nodded at Ethan. Good dog, he told Ranger, who allowed the compliment like a monarch enduring ceremony. Good man, Hank added to Ethan, as if it cost him nothing and everything. When the road had no more truck in it, Sarah's shoulders dropped the inch they'd been holding up the sky. Her breath came and didn't stumble. Ethan said nothing for a long moment. He just let the air settle and the world put itself back where it belonged. Then he turned to her and said, You all right? I'm standing, she said. That's the whole answer. Inside, the house took them in with plain kindness. Ranger flopped on the rug with a huff that sounded like victory. Sarah picked up the pencil and wrote her name again, not because she needed to, because she could. She added a word she'd practiced beneath it. Home. Later, when darkness swam up the hill and the stove's tin sides ticked their lullaby, Sarah told a story she hadn't told anyone. How at 15 she had tried to run the first time and had been fetched back and made an example of, how the bruise on her shoulder blade had lasted like a season. Ethan listened like a craftsman, eyes on her face, hands quiet, every line of him an agreement to be present without trespass. When she finished, she didn't feel emptied. She felt like weight had been moved from a backpack to a shelf. Tomorrow, Ethan said softly. We'll take Ranger on the ridge trail. There's a place where the wind carves the snow into ribs. It makes a sound like a choir. You should hear something beautiful right after hearing something true. She smiled, a small, sideways thing, like dawn deciding. Outside, the past drove away. Inside, the future made tea. Chapter 4, A Winter to Survive. The storm came like a slow animal, padding in on soft paws and then sitting on the house with its full weight. The first day was pretty, the second, expensive, the third, survival. Drifts walled the porch half-high. The road became a suggestion. Ethan rationed wood with a carpenter's math, board feet in, hours out, while Sarah turned flour and onions and a heel of cheese into something that tasted like a plan. Ranger slept more, nose tucked under his tail, conserving heat with the pragmatic elegance of his kind. On the fourth morning, Ethan slung his old rifle, shrugged into a canvas chore coat over the field jacket, and wrapped a scarf that had known other winters. Just the lower ridge, he said. 2 hours. If I'm not back in 3, text Mrs. Alvarez to call Hank to start cussing me from the road. He grinned without humor and tapped the shelf where a charged radio and a prepaid flip phone sat like talismans. I'll come, Sarah said reflexively. He shook his head. Storm logic, he said. 1 walker makes 1 set of mistakes, 2 make 4. Ranger stood, weight shifting from paw to paw in that pre-hunt dance unique to dogs who know their job. You stay, Ethan told him. Ranger's ears swiveled backward in grievance, then forward in compliance. Guard, Ethan added, and the ears settled. Hours lengthened without their usual furniture. Sarah fed the stove, tidied what didn't need tidying, wrote her name and the date, and then ran out of room on the practice board. She started a new board with words Ethan had drawn for her. Wood, bread, ridge, safe. She was writing safe for the 5th time when the wind shifted like a door in an old house, and Ranger erupted from his nap, all at once sound and motion. He whined, a note like wire, and stood on the threshold, looking from her to the door, as if language might come if he believed hard enough. Okay, she said, voice already shaking, not from panic, but from the body's rehearsal of it. She grabbed her coat, scarf, the radio, the bright blue medical kit Ethan kept by the door, and the headlamp he'd taught her to wear even in daylight, because whiteout doesn't care about noon. Outside, snow gnawed at sound. Ranger tracked without flourish, head low, nose cutting the drift like a boat's prow, feet precise. The world had narrowed to white and the dog's deliberate decisions. 20 minutes in, they found it, a churned patch by the lower ridge, the snow carved into ugly shapes by struggle. Blood had painted a grammar of dots and smears, not profuse but not casual. Then, a darker shape against the birch stand. Ethan, half sitting against a trunk, one leg extended wrong, coat open, faced the gray of a morning too early. Hey, he said, as if she'd just returned from the store. Stupid trap, elk trap judged by the chain. My fault. Ranger nosed him, then backed off to let Sarah work. She had never run toward blood before. Her life had always walked away from it. Now she moved with a competence she hadn't known she owned. Knife to cut the pant leg, gauze, pressure, radio clipped to her collar. The wound was a ragged puncture high on the thigh where the trap's spring arm had bitten. Bleeding slowed with pressure but re-argued when pressed wrong. The leg's angle spoke of a small fracture or a good bruise. Either way, movement was payment. I need you to talk, she said, breath fogging, to stay on the bridge while I build the road. He smiled, lips pale. Copy. How many fingers? She held up 3. He got it right. Lightheaded? A little drunk on weather? Pain? Ambitious. Good. She packed the wound, wrapped tight, splinted what could be splinted with 2 saplings, and the scarf and a strip of her own coat lining, cursing quietly the whole time in a style Mrs. Alvarez would approve of. Ranger leaned his warm body against Ethan's good side, a living prop. Can you stand if we help you cheat? She asked. Define stand, he said, but the corners of his eyes softened at the gallows humor. Between Ranger's braced stance and Sarah's shoulder, they levered Ethan up, then into a hobbling shuffle that covered feet like miles. It took them 45 minutes to make 20, then 30 to make 10, numbers that would have broken her if she'd looked at them too closely. She didn't. She looked at Ranger's ears and the way they tracked wind and threat and encouragement all at once. And she looked at Ethan's mouth where it set with stubbornness and apology and trust in a woman who did not yet have enough practice being trusted. The house received them like a port. She stripped the bed, laid down plastic sheeting, cut away cloth with hands that shook after, not during. Ethan's thigh bled again when the bandage shifted. She repacked, tighter, her voice steady, telling him the steps even when he knew them, because continuity is as much medicine as sutures. You did good, he said, when the worst was temporarily over. You did alive, she corrected, and only afterward let herself tremble. A controlled burn. Mrs. Alvarez arrived with the soft brutality of competence, cheeks flushed from the walk, bag clinking with jars. Soup, sugar, neighbor gossip, she announced, and my boy Carlos's old crutches. He broke his leg sledding in '02 and still insists the tree came at him. Carlos Alvarez, 40, showed up behind her, big-shouldered and gentle-eyed in a reflective road crew jacket, sparse beard flecked with snow, a man whose patience made his father leave and his mother stay. He had the kind of voice that makes kids stop crying without knowing why. Let me look, he said, not as a doctor, but as a person who had spent a decade on volunteer search and rescue and another 10 lifting things heavier than his stories. He checked circulation, made a better splint, and professionally admired Sarah's first draft. Not bad, he said. Better than my first time, and mine was a goat. He grinned. She laughed because laughter is a kind of permission slip back into the world. That night, pain and fever took turns visiting. Sarah read the instructions on the antibiotic bottle Mrs. Alvarez had kept since Carlos's last infection, checked dates, texted the urgent care nurse Mrs. Alvarez knew. Lydia Hart, 32, dark curls pinned under a gray beanie, precise and direct even by text. Got dosage guidance that felt like a rope thrown across a river. Ranger alternated sentry and sleeping heater. At 3 a.m., when Ethan murmured nonsense in a voice that had traveled back to heat and dust and a radio with too much static, Sarah put a cool cloth on his forehead and spoke soft syllables of the present. Stove, snow, dog, safe. In the days that followed, the wound respected pressure and medicine, then began to knit. Ethan moved from bed to chair to porch, leaning on Carlos's crutches with the grim good humor of a man who speaks fluent setback. Sarah collected kindling with Ranger, learned the tempo of wood stove and humidity so the air didn't split their lips, learned the resting weight of calm. When the storm finally burned through and the sky went hard blue, the world felt newly carved. Lydia Hart hiked up herself, carrying a proper medical bag and the quiet authority of competence. She was mid-height, strong under a down jacket, quick smile that vanished when the task sharpened, hazel eyes that held you steady until you told the truth. Nurse practitioner, she introduced with a firm handshake. I do clinics and bad timing. Let's see what you've got. She peeled back the bandage, nodded at the clean edges, praised the packing, reseated the wrap with hands that moved like music you can study. Good work, she said to Sarah, and that stamp traveled deep. When Lydia left, she looked from Ethan to Sarah to Ranger and back like a census taker counting a household, then said, You three are a triangle. Don't forget all sides hold. The first trip down to town felt like disembarking a ship. The store smelled of oranges and cardboard and possibility. Mrs. Alvarez fussed over them as if fussing were a sacrament. Hank Doyle slapped Ethan's back, then winced and apologized, then slipped Ranger a contraband biscuit that Ranger accepted with grace and secrecy. On the way home, a small boy stood by the road, mittens mismatched, eyes wide. That your dog? He asked Sarah, not bothering with Ethan because kids know who belongs to whom by who smiles first. He's our dog, Sarah said, and the plural did not frighten her. That night, when the house sighed itself toward sleep, Ethan studied Sarah's face. It had changed. Not its bones or its colors, but its bearing. The muscles that had spent years managing other people's storms had begun to learn their own weather. You held the tatu line, he said. You didn't make a speech. You just did it. She shrugged, a little embarrassed. You would have done the same. Maybe, he said. But you did. Ranger's tail thumped once, a period. Outside, stars freckled the clean, cruel sky. Inside, a triangle held. Chapter 5. Under the winter sky. The thaw arrived not as a day but as a rumor spread by dripping eaves and softening ruts. The ridge trailed blue smoke from cabins as if the mountain was thinking. Ethan walked without crutches by then, a slight hitch in his step that he ignored with professional skill. Sarah's handwriting, once a shaky fence, had become straight grain. Her words multiplied into lists on the fridge. Wood, salt, flour, teach, teach. It started with one kid, the mittened boy from the roadside. Tommy Reed, 8, narrow and quick. Brown eyes, too serious. A missing front tooth giving his words a whistle. His mother, Joanne Reed, 35, hair pulled back with the efficiency of a woman who works 2 jobs, cheeks reddened by cold and by a life that required speed, brought eggs and the careful posture of someone asking for a favor she would repay thrice. He's behind, Joanne said, standing on the porch as if afraid to dirty the floor with need. He's bright, but school's been messy. If you had a spare hour... Sarah had a spare hour and a spare heart. She wrote the alphabet on a long board Ethan had planned and mounted, and Ranger lay by the door like a librarian whose rules were all about kindness. Tommy read dog and log and fog, then grinned, his gap-toothed face alight. The second week brought June Park, 9, compact and fierce in a red coat, black hair in 2 braids, daughter of Min Park, 42, a quiet machinist with hands nicked from metal and eyes that softened around his child. June spelled her name in block capitals and then in script and declared her future. I will be a pilot or a detective or both. Sarah wrote both, underlining it twice, and June nodded like a contract had been signed. Soon, Sundays became assemblies. Mrs. Alvarez arrived with cookies and a voice like a trumpet when the children's murmur edged toward chaos. Hank told stories from the mine that turned into math problems without the kids noticing. Lydia stopped by monthly to check Ethan's leg and to dispense smirking advice about rest he would not take. Carlos repaired the fence and pretended not to blush when Mrs. Alvarez called him handsome. The town, which had watched Sarah from a distance as if she were weather, something to endure or fear, began to treat her like climate, something to live within. On a Friday glazed with sunlight, Ethan set a small carved box on the table. It smelled faintly of cedar. The lid bore 3 carved lines that met in a triangle. Inside lay 2 bands, wood, not gold, walnut warmed by oil and the long touch of thumbs. He looked at Sarah as if asking and promising at once. Ethan Cole had never been good with speeches. War and wood had taught him to measure twice and cut once, and his words followed the same rule. "I've built porches and coffins and the kind of shelves that keep heavy things from falling," he said. "Nothing I built was finished until this place had your voice in it. I don't want to own you. I want to stand next to you while you belong to yourself." Sarah Turner, who had been sold and named useless and then learned the geometry of choice, breathed in and out and felt the axis of her life click into true. She took the band and the hand that offered it. "Then stand there," she said, smiling with a steadiness that updated her face. "Because I'm not moving." Ranger stood, tail lifting into a proud flag, as if he had known the plan all along. The ceremony happened beneath the tallest pine on the ridge, because churches are where you bring your hunger, and the ridge had fed them. The sky wore a wash of high cloud, like thin silk. Mrs. Alvarez officiated the way grandmothers officiate, bossy and tender. "Marriage is 3 things," she declared. "A promise you make, a promise you keep, and a promise you remake when you're tired and the sink is full." Hank said, "Amen." Lydia cleared her throat like she was keeping her professional composure. Tommy and June scattered pine needles on the snow as confetti. Min Park took photos on a phone held carefully like a hymn book. Joanne wiped her eyes with a mitten and laughed at herself. Ethan slipped the walnut ring on Sarah's finger. Sarah slipped the twin on his. The wood was warm from hands and from the notion that trees, like people, are stronger in rings. Ethan's voice caught. "I was trained to run toward the broken thing," he said softly. "You taught me how to stand still for the healing." Sarah's voice was low and fierce. "I used to believe I was worth what others could take from me. Now I know I am worth what I choose to give." Ranger chuffed, which everyone decided meant kiss already, and they did, and the ridge held the sound like a vessel. That night, the cabin glowed with the kind of light that comes less from fire and more from agreement. The chalkboard wore new words: today, family, grace. Sarah sat at the table writing lesson plans, hair loose down her back, face open. Ethan carved a shelf for the growing library, a row of second-hand paperbacks, a dictionary preached over by Mrs. Alvarez, a thin book of Psalms someone had left in a box on their porch, with a note in a hand, old and careful. For days when the sky is too much. He opened it and read quietly, not out of duty but out of curiosity, finding lines that sounded like rivers under snow. "Do you believe in miracles?" Sarah asked later, when Ranger had curled into his cama by the fire and the house sang its small settling song. Ethan thought of the IED that should have ended him and didn't, the handler Ranger had lost, and the way the dog had found a new pack, the trap on the ridge and the woman who had turned fear into hands. "I believe in things we don't yet have words for," he said, "and in the hands that show up anyway. I think," she said slowly, "that grace is just a miracle we live into, one choice at a time." He nodded. Outside, the pines spoke scripture in wind. Inside, they made their own liturgy, bread broken, letters learned, a dog watching the door. On Sunday, the little school held its first reading day. Tommy read a poem about snow and trains. June read a biography page about Bessie Coleman, and then announced that planes were the most honest machines because they had to tell the truth to the sky or fall. Joanne brought cinnamon rolls that tasted like a holiday found in the pocket of an ordinary week. Min fixed the wobbly chair. Hank told a joke so bad it caused a communal groan that released something cramped in everyone's chest. Mrs. Alvarez made a speech that ended with, "If you don't clean up your cups, I will haunt you all, and I am excellent at haunting." Lydia arrived late, apologized, checked Ethan's leg with satisfied nods, then stayed to teach the kids how to wrap a sprained wrist, because literacy includes the body. When some of the town's hard-faced men paused at the window and looked in, not quite ready to admit they were curious about the kind of joy that didn't cost shame, Ranger lifted his head and watched and did not bark. That was permission, too. As dusk walked up the hill and the children tumbled out into the softening snow, Sarah stepped onto the porch with Ethan and Ranger. The sky above Butte wore that impossible Montana purple, bruised and holy. She took Ethan's hand. "Under this winter sky," she said, "I feel held." He squeezed her fingers. "That's not the sky," he said. "That's us." And then, because human hearts reach for the frame that can hold them, they bowed their heads for a quiet prayer. Not the loud kind, but the honest one. "God," Ethan said, voice hushed, "thank you for a door that opened, for a dog that taught us how to wait, for a woman who said no and yes in the same brave breath. Bless whoever needs a warm room and a clear choice tonight." "Amen," Sarah whispered, and Ranger thumped his tail once as if to sign.